Thank you for coming. My project involves the retrieval and analysis of early 20th century science fiction from Australian newspapers. This work lies at the intersection between digital humanities and science fiction studies, with science fiction studies being my main theoretical framework. In this presentation, I will introduce these broader fields, give some background on Australian newspaper fiction retrieval, discuss my main research question, outline my thesis paper plan, describe what I have done so far, and explore expected future difficulties. Concluding, I'll discuss the significance of the research and answer questions. And so, digital humanities. Digital humanities, also known as computational literary studies, is, at its most basic, the name for any work done with large digital archives of literature where the questions asked and actions taken focus on the collection of works as a whole rather than through close reading of the texts. Various methods are available, such as a classifier, which, once trained, can assign to collections of non-fiction texts their specific categories, with some of the most successful results coming from artificial neural network classifiers. Guerra et al. Created one in 2021 to classify a collection of movie synopses into subject categories. Another is topic modeling, where programs can scan the vocabulary in a specific text or groups of text and give an estimate of the subject that text is about. Asmussen and Moller in Denmark in 2019 showed that they could use topic modeling to create an exploratory literature review of recent papers on chosen subjects without reading the papers. As I will be working with the To Be Continued and the Trove databases to retrieve fiction. By using these methods, I will be better able to locate science fiction stories in the huge databases of files much faster than simple manual searching. Also, rewriting these tools for the science fiction genre contributes new code to the methods which can be repurposed by future researchers. Now, science fiction studies. Science fiction studies is a multidisciplinary field that analyzes science fiction in all its forms and how it shapes society, culture, and the human condition. This will inform the theoretical framework for my thesis. Being familiar with the definitions and facets of science fiction research is crucial to understanding the megatext that influences most, if not all, science fiction. Unfortunately, within science fiction studies, there has been limited research on early science fiction in Australian newspapers. A companion to Science Fiction by Seed, for example, contains a chapter by Aiken and McMullen on Australian science fiction history. But it only mentions a single newspaper science fiction story, Australia Advanced, or Dialogues for the Year 2032, published in the Sydney Gazette in May 1832. With many newspaper stories from the 20th century only having recently been rediscovered by the To Be Continued database researchers, and no detailed work having been done on the science fiction ones, this is a gap in Australia's science fiction publishing history that I will fill. Now some background on newspaper fiction retrieval in Australia. 9 years ago, Catherine Bode and Carol Hetherington began work on creating the To Be Continued database, launched in 2018, which now contains over 51,000 fiction stories from Australian newspapers. However, not all the serialized and single-issue published stories in this database have been analyzed, so it is not known what genres many of the stories might fit into. Due to the size of the database, researchers have begun to specialize in particular genres. Projects using the To Be Continued database have included retrieving works on Christmas stories, Wellhand 2018, gold mining stories, Dalziel 2019, and bushfire stories, Morgan 2021. But extensive research has not been done on a number of different genres, including science fiction. Taking the view that digital humanities methods and the science fiction studies framework would enable me to retrieve and recognize science fiction stories more successfully than other genres, especially considering the propensity for science fiction to also include science vocabulary, I decided to focus on this genre. Now that you have some understanding of the background, here is my research question. How did the publication and syndication of short and serialized science fiction stories in Australian newspapers from 1901 to 1939 contribute to the evolution of Australian science fiction and reflect Australia's changing cultural identity? In the introduction, I gave you some background on digital humanities, science fiction studies, and newspaper fiction retrieval. Now, here is a rough outline of my plan for my thesis, considering that these chapters might change once I've conducted close reading of the discovered texts. My thesis is divided into 3 different sections, covering about 6 chapters. Section 1 explores the background, methodology and discovery, going into detail about the history of newspaper fiction worldwide. Then in Australia, the kinds of genres available, and the prolific publishing of science fiction in newspapers, along with gaps in the research. This section also contains the literature review, covering the latest research in retrieving and analyzing large databases of fiction in digital humanities, and what has been done related to newspaper fiction, before exploring the history and current focus of science fiction studies, expanding on its lens as the ideal theoretical framework. Section 2 is the main body of the thesis, and it is where I conduct extensive comparative analysis on the retrieved texts and explore print culture. More specifically, the recursive interplay and co-influential aspects between evolving science articles, science fiction stories, the public, scientists, and Australian cultural identity. Section 3 is the concluding section, focusing on digital scholarship, with the intention of, through these studies, adding to and reshaping Australian literary studies, digital humanities, and science fiction studies. This section also explores my additional component, the Digital Scholarly Edition. The Digital Scholarly Edition component will feature cleaned versions of science fiction stories and related science articles, curated. Each science fiction story introduced with a critical argument. Downloadable thematic collections created for the public. Auto-generating cover. Essays and other information. Currently, there is just a placeholder image and some text. This leads into my next slide. What's been done so far? Reading hundreds of texts across multiple disciplines including literary studies, science and technology studies, science fiction studies, digital humanities, publishing studies, and more, to familiarize myself with current and historical research while searching for the most appropriate theory or theories, and also to confirm that what I wanted to do hasn't been done before. Extensive reading on genre studies to determine the best way to define the early or proto-science fiction field, also known at the time as science in fiction. Training myself on Python, Sklite Studio, and Anaconda to develop several Python programs, working with Sklite databases, enabling me to extract and analyze newspaper fiction records. Analyzing over 580,000 files and sorting them into 51,000 folders. Concatenating these pieces of TXT files into 25,000 story files, with 8,000 chosen for more data analysis, and a lot of draft writing. From this research I found a few problems. I'll briefly go over these and how I plan to fix them. 1. Extracting the stories. Some initial experiments using Python and Sklite databases I've run haven't given useful results, as many stories are missing the majority of their chapters in the to-be-continued database. To get around this, I'll retrieve the missing pieces from Trove, where possible, and run more refined versions of these again. 2. Reading stories. If the OCR records in the to-be-continued database are illegible, I can go to the original image on Trove, visit libraries personally to take photos of the missing pieces, or pay for rescans through their digitizing services. 3. Finding more stories. While I've been able to retrieve around 30 stories that I can confidently define as science fiction, there are more to be discovered, so multiple methods need to be used. To find more, I will begin work on a classifier that can be trained on science fiction stories of the early 20th century that I have already found, then I'll use this classifier to scan through the database of 8,000 stories to locate more. No doubt there will be other problems, and I will find a way around them. And so, to sum up, the significance of retrieving lost Australian newspaper science fiction from the to-be-continued and Trove databases is that it will enhance Australia's literary history, expand on our limited knowledge of Australian science fiction published before the 1940s, and advance our understanding of the culture and customs of the time, revealing further insights into how science fiction was received and perceived, and enabling a qualified name for Australia's early 20th century science fiction era. By making all records and programs available through a digital scholarly edition, the research will engage the public's interest and enable scholars interested in locating works in other genres to continue to build and expand on Australia's early publishing history. Thank you. And here are my references. Are there any questions? If you could post in the comments section below, I'd be happy to read them. Thank you for your attention. Don't forget to subscribe to the Science Fiction Research channel